Hi, and good afternoon from Lincoln, Nebraska. My name is Nate Blum. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Sorghum United. I regret that I'm unable to be there, was unable to be there with you in person for your recent conference. I understand that it was really well attended, and kudos to all of the organizers and participants for being a part of that. I further regret that at the time that I was to record to your conference, I experienced a router failure, and so that's quite unfortunate. But I'm happy to be with you today. Let me go ahead and get started here. And again, I was recently in Jaipur, by the way, visited the Rajasthan Agricultural Research Institute while I was in India. Unfortunately, the timing just didn't work out for me to be able to be at your conference, but I hope to visit your university sometime in the next few months when I find myself back in India. So let me tell you a little bit about Sorghum United and what we're doing here. And we'll start with the title of this presentation, which is the role of sorghum and millets in reshaping global food and agricultural paradigms. And this is why I get excited about doing what I do. So let me go ahead and advance my screen. Here we go. So Sorghum United, we are an international NGO. We have more than 100 stakeholders, and actually our global network continues to grow. And they are located on every continent and represent all points within the value chain. So everyone from farmers to seed processors to seed dealers, researchers, seed companies, equipment manufacturers, value-added food, fuel, and fiber processing, as well as even consumers. And what we try to do is just create a connectivity between what is really a small market globally for sorghum and millets. And we'll talk more about why we feel that is completely important. A lot of what we do is to facilitate, not necessarily provide, but facilitate, aggregate producer resources, provide consumer education, and we have some unique ways in which we do that we'll talk about here in a little while. Most importantly, this is all intended to develop value-added markets. Everybody who's watching this presentation and who attended the conference, they understand the importance of sorghum and millets as far as in regard to nutrition and environmental benefits. But the reality is we can't ask our farmers to grow these crops if there aren't value-added markets, valuable markets in which they can access. Most importantly, also, we try to empower people through the connectivity of value chains. This is true not only globally, but actually locally as well, which we feel is really important when we talk about food security and supply chain issues, such as we experienced during COVID. So let me start by backing up just a little bit here, now that you know a little bit about what Sorghum United is. Let me talk about the challenge when we talk about markets development. Often this is described to me as a chicken and an egg situation. We want farmers to grow it, but we need consumers to demand it. How can consumers demand it if farmers aren't growing it, right? So I look back when I think about what this challenge means and how incredible this challenge is for us. I look back to a gentleman named David Fairchild. David Fairchild was an American born in Kansas to a university president. And as such, growing up in an agricultural community at an agricultural university, they hosted his family, people from around the world, guest lecturers and things like this. And so David became exposed to different ideas in agriculture. And as a result, he spent his career actually working eventually for the USDA, which was at the time a brand new organization. This is, again, late 1800s, early 1900s. And what he wanted to do was reshape American agriculture, which at the time only had a few crops in rotation, a lot of barley and wheat, things like that. And he did so by traveling around the planet and discovering for the Western world these crops that we take for granted today. Now, in order to do this, he didn't have television, he didn't have a telephone, didn't have internet, there was no air travel. So this is all done by letters and mailings and boats. And, it wasn't just the introduction of the crops, but then once they're introduced, you have to create a market. And he was able to do all these things, not just for one type of cereal grain like millets, but for literally hundreds of different types of crops. Everything that we take for granted in North America today, from mangoes in Florida to avocados in California, to ornamental plants and landscaping plants around the country. and even the Japanese cherry blossoms that we celebrate in Washington, D.C. every year. These are all a result of David Fairchild. This is an excellent book, by the way, called The Food Explorer. I highly recommend that you take a read. It travels through David's entire life and career, his entire professional development, and details the challenges and the struggles that he faced. It's really inspirational to me, and it's a book that I cite very often because what we're trying to do with Sorghum and Millets is create these value markets, bring these crops into greater production in areas where they already have some familiarity, whether it's good or bad. And if we have the tools of the internet, television, radio, air travel, all these different things, if we have these tools today, why certainly is there any excuse that we can't do what David Fairchild did nearly 100 years ago in creating these markets for our farmers? So let's talk about why this is important and what we're trying to achieve overall at Sorghum United. And we start by talking about the modern commodity marketing model. Now, I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a farm just about 50 miles west of where I live now in Lincoln, Nebraska. And that farm had 3 crops in rotation primarily. It had beans, wheat, and milo, milo being the North American land race for sorghum. Now, I can tell you, having grown up on a farm that operates solely and exclusively in the commodity marketing model, that most farmers are land rich and cash poor. And why is that? It's because we grow our crops as a commodity. It means that we cannot control the value of those crops. So the only way to really truly be competitive in a commodity marketing model is to grow as much as we possibly can. But by the way, when we grow as much as we possibly can, our input prices go up. And because not only us, but our neighbors are also growing as much as they possibly can, we're producing more and introducing it to the market at a similar time, maybe even the same time frame. And as a result, the laws of supply and demand mean that there's a decreased price for our product that we're growing, regardless of what that grain is. So now we've got not only rising input costs, but decreasing profits. So our margins become incredibly thin. In the United States, what this has meant is farm consolidation. Farm families like mine. Now, I grew up as a 4th generation farmer. A lot of those farms, ours included, were just not big enough to survive. As other farmers became, conventional farmers became much, much larger. In fact, the farm family, and I am clear that this was a farm family, it was several brothers and their sons, that we rented our ground to for a while, farmed 17,000 acres here in Nebraska, and they're not the largest farmers. At the same time, this kind of marketing model has really promoted monoculture cropping systems. In that area where we used to grow beans, wheat, and milo, now the rotation is corn on soybeans. Now in Nebraska, we only have one growing season. So that means 2 years in a row, you're growing corn, the next year you're growing soybeans, and then you're back to corn again. Now, we have farmers here, like that farm family we rented to, that when we talk to them about sorghum in particular, and the benefits from an environmental standpoint, water conservation, nutrients in the soil, breaking up the compaction layer that can increase yields for the other crops, which we'll talk more about later. They say, this is great. We'd love to grow sorghum in our rotation, but we don't have anywhere to sell it. The local grain elevator doesn't take it, and there's no value-added processing. So what we're concerned about here at Sorghum United really isn't how much we grow. We're concerned about how much are our farmers able to sell it for, right? Where's the value? We want value rather than volume. That's what we really promote. One of the ways to do this, to promote value over volume, is to decrease our overdependence on singular trading partners. A good example of that is here in the United States, 93% of sorghum goes to China, which is great when they're buying. Although even when they're buying, because they buy such large volumes, market prices can be easily manipulated. Last time I looked, sorghum was trading at about $12.58 per metric ton compared to corn, which was at $255 US per metric ton. This is a big problem. And it's even worse when they don't buy, right? Because when they don't buy, and we saw this in the recent trade dispute between the United States and China, sorghum was the first crop that was kind of the shot across the bow in that trade dispute. And when they're not buying, the price is then obviously even worse. And it's not just a US problem, by the way. China buys 80% of the global supply of sorghum. So we feel that, of course, we want these international trading partners. We want to value, being able to provide inexpensive grain that can feed people. But at the same time, we need to mitigate that commodity marketing model risk through local value-added processing for sorghum. And that's where we get into development of regional value chains. We really, and there's some great work, by the way. I was just recently traveled around the world, and I can tell you, whether it's West Africa or South Asia and Southeast Asia, I can tell you that wherever I've gone, I've seen these wonderful initiatives around value-added processing, startup incubators for companies to come in, for entrepreneurs to come in, learn how to create products using sorghum and millets. This is particularly true in India, although I saw it also in Senegal and West Africa. However, these value chains are still very disconnected. So this is one of the things that we can work on in Sorghum United, is helping to let these value chains continue to grow by connecting farmers with processors, processors with consumers and customers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we're also going to be talking about the environmental impacts that sorghum can have on a changing climate, I think it's important to note that Texas A&M University recently published, last year, 2022, published a study that showed that because of sorghum's larger root biomass, the plant is actually an ideal option in in sequestering carbon and burying it deeper in the soil for longer. And so if we're going to be talking about that story, we need to be also talking about some of the things that are causing this carbon buildup in the atmosphere. And one thing that doesn't get talked about, and again, we're not anti-trade, okay? We definitely need trade. But we have to recognize that the number one carbon emitter in the world is not cows emitting methane on Nebraska farms. It's actually transoceanic shipping. Transoceanic shipping is the largest producer of carbon released into the atmosphere. And so as we develop regional value chains, we can diminish the impact of that while creating food security opportunities at the local level. So again, we talked a little bit about this in the last slide, but I got to tell you, it's not a zero-sum game. We want to supplement the commodity marketing model, not replace it. We need the commodity marketing model. It provides inexpensive food. It provides for the relationships that happen with international trade. It provides countries like the United States and like India that maybe overproduce in some of these categories. It allows us then to feed other parts of the world. This is very important. So we're not talking about getting rid of that. It's very, I can't overstress how important that commodity marketing model is to global food security. But at the same time, it creates a tremendous amount of volatility and risk, just like we talked about recently, just in the last couple slides about sorghum. And it discourages diversification. So what we really want to do is create these supplemental value-based regional markets where we can collect a local farmer who can maybe still grow their other grains, their corn, their wheat, their rice, and they can sell those as a commodity. But perhaps they can, in their rotation, include sorghum and millets as a mitigating factor that they can sell via direct contract to a local processor. So the local processor can say, I need X amount of this variety of this grain. They can get it under contract, maybe above the market price that they would see as a commodity. They can lock that in, and they can mitigate that market risk in their other crops through the local value chain. And in so doing, by the way, we can increase nutritive outcomes within a community because and we'll talk more about this later as well, but we know the importance of sorghum and millets in human diets, as well as creating jobs and entrepreneurial opportunities and economic prosperity within a community by fostering local value chains. Local value chains, of course, decrease the logistic challenges for the processors and the farmers, which then lowers carbon footprints because you're decreasing supply lines and supply chains. Creation of regional economic opportunities. Again, entrepreneurs are creating jobs. This lifts everyone up. as well as providing better prices to the farmers and lower cost to the processor by, again, shortening the value chains, shortening the supply lines. And in so doing, we're also then promoting biodiversity, water conservation, and soil health, which are all aspects of what sorghum and millets bring to the table when they're included in cropping systems and cropping rotations. And here's another zero-sum game I want to get off the table. At Sorghum United, we do also work with millets. Obviously, in most of the world, sorghum is considered a major millet versus a minor millet. In India, I came across a term I really loved, which was Shriana. This is a fantastic term and a great way to describe sorghum, by the way. But we also like corn and wheat and rice and soybeans. What I like to say is that there's room on the plate for everybody. So why don't we advocate for all of those different crops? Well, those other larger commodities, sorghum being the fifth most important, only the fifth most important cereal grain in the world, they don't need the advocacy, really. I mean, people understand what they are already. Sorghum and millets are misunderstood or completely forgotten about by some of our farmers and much of the consumer population. So we spend our time really focusing on these grains in particular because they're the ones that need the strongest advocacy. So let's talk about the market's value. I'm a farm kid. I mentioned this earlier. So I understand that farmers aren't going to grow something they can't make a profit on. And processors aren't going to invest in a product that they can't sell. So a few years ago, when I was the director of the Nebraska Grain Sorghum Board prior to my role at Sorghum United here, I did a little markets research. This is 2019 data, which I presented at the Sorghum ID conference in Toulouse, France that year. And I wanted to see, when we talk about sorghum's unique traits in the consumer market, what does that value look like, right? So I broke it down into a few categories. Functional foods, meaning food as medicine or nutraceuticals. Given the research that we'll talk about here in a little bit in regard to human health and human diets, you'll see why this is an important one. Global value, $173.26 billion with a compound annual growth rate of 77%. That's not just an annual growth rate of 77%. That is a compound annual growth rate. Actually, I do apologize. I'm sorry. That number was incorrect. It is 7.7%. There is a missing decimal on this slide. So compound annual growth rate of 7.7%, which is still nothing to sneeze at. Non-GMO. Now, like I tell our farmers, much of the world wants non-GMO products. If we look at the science, we can see from multiple scientific publications that there really are no detriments to humans in GMO products. In fact, we've had GMO products since Gregory Mendel started playing with peas, or you could go even further back, and when mankind started to use breeding, traditional breeding, plant breeding, to create the species and the varieties that worked best for them. So the way in which it's done is different, but regardless, it doesn't matter. If you have a non-GMO crop like sorghum and millets are, and you have a customer base that wants non-GMO, well, then you, my friend, have an advantage. And our job then is to provide the customers what they want. So we need to do a better job of listening to our consumers, our customers, rather than arguing with our customers about whether or not they're right about their whatever preconception it is in regard to agriculture. So in non-GMO, that global value is was in 2019, $947.8 million with a compound annual growth rate of 16.5%. So growing very, very quickly. Sustainability. Customers care about sustainability. Customers want to know that they're doing the right thing. They feel like they're doing the right thing. Most customers will purchase based upon their emotions and wanting to feel like they're making part of a change. So the global value of a product that is sustainable, for all the reasons that we talked about with sorghum already, global value at that time was $872 billion with a compound annual growth rate of 7%. That's only gotten higher since 2019. And of course, sorghum being gluten-free, global value of that, $21.61 billion with a compound annual growth rate of 9.2%. Gluten-free is not just important for folks who are celiac or gluten intolerant. It's important for folks who for whatever reason, have a preconception that they don't want gluten in their diet. And so sorghum provides an opportunity to provide a product to them. Let's talk about the climate impacts of sorghum and millets, and let's dive in a little bit. I love this slide. When we talk about water conservation, we talk about sorghum in particular using a third of the water of other crops. This slide comes to us from New Mexico State University. I saw it in a presentation by one of their professors a few years ago and immediately asked for it to be sent to me because this is amazing. Look at this. So the higher the blue on the graph there, the more water is in the soil there. So you can see with the cover crops that we used here in this study, you can see that they're drawing that water down. And then when they plant sorghum in rotation following the cover crops, the water doesn't only not draw down, it actually increases back to the top. It regenerates because sorghum uses so little. And then you have the following cover crop, which again, they must have a little bit of more of a drought there, dip that water table down some more. And then sorghum at the end pulls it right back up with just a little bit of that green at the top. This is huge. I mean, I've been in places like Jordan where they're literally drilling wells 4,000 feet deep in order to get water. And they're trying to grow corn in the desert. Again, nothing wrong with corn, but if it doesn't fit in your ecology, it's not going to fit in your sustainability. And so sorghum provides a great opportunity. And not only does it use less water, but it's drought resistant. Now, what that means is that when you get into a hot and dry drought situation, your other crops like maize, for example, or wheat, they'll burn up, they'll die. Sorghum, being part of the Poaceae grass family, will actually go dormant. And while this dormancy, depending on how long it lasts, will definitely impact your yields. We saw this in Nebraska just last year. We had tremendous drought. All of the crops failed except for sorghum. And even the sorghum, it was so dry in some places, only produced about 30 to 50 bushels an acre, which is really, really terrible. But at least those farmers got something. They got part of something rather than all of nothing. And so when it rains again, when it gets some moisture, it'll perk back up and at least produce some yield for you. We talked about carbon sequestration. Again, this is research that can be easily searched on the internet. Texas A&M University, 2022, they released that study. And actually, the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, has invested an additional $65 million into grants to really quantify what sorghum means for what we call climate smart cropping here in the United States. So we know from Texas A&M that sorghum is better at capturing more carbon and sequestering it deeper and for longer in the soil. But now we're working on actually quantifying what that means. What do the numbers look like? And so that is going on right now. From a soil health impact, of course, that larger root biomass as compared to other crops means you're leaving more biology in the soil. And because the crop's root system goes down 6 feet or more, you're breaking up that compaction layer in the soil. The compaction layer is actually one of the biggest issues in agriculture globally, because what happens is you've got this layer of compaction about 5.5, 6 feet deep in the soil. And when other crops that have weaker root systems come upon that, rather than being able to penetrate it, they just spread like this. And what that means is that they cannot access nutrients and water from deeper in the soil. Sorghum, on the other hand, breaks up that compaction layer. And what we see from research from the Kansas State University back in the early 2000s, so this is not groundbreaking at this point, but what we found, or what they found rather, was that following corn or maize or wheat or soybean in cropping systems after sorghum, because of the benefits sorghum leaves in the soil, most farmers saw an average of 8% increase in yields for their following crops. So it's not just good for your cropping system in this season, but in the next planting season as well, you'll see benefits. And then wildlife habitat. Everybody who's been around sorghum and millets, they know that you have a diverse range of insects, birds, and others. And I can tell you from experience, living in a part of a state where we used to grow sorghum in particular, in addition to these other crops, and then taking it out of rotation within the last 30 years, we have definitely seen a precipitous drop in biodiversity in the part of the state that I live in. This is a big problem for our future sustainability. So what are the human impacts for sorghum and millets? Okay, why would people want to eat these? Well, first of all, let's look at this. This chart, this table, comes to us from the United Sorghum Checkoff Program, which is the national taxpayer-funded advocacy for sorghum in the United States. Not millets, just sorghum. We are a taxpayer. We are not a taxpayer-funded organization. They're taxpayer-funded, so we're not the same. But the content that they produce, because it's taxpayer funded, is public information, and we're always glad to lift up when they provide good resources. So this table compares the nutritive value of sorghum versus corn, wheat, oats, rice, and quinoa. And the more green on the table there, the better you're off. So if you look at sorghum, I mean, everything from protein to vitamins and minerals, sorghum just beats all of the other options. In fact, what's terrible, and you have a lot of this in your diet there in India as well, look at rice. The nutritive value for rice compared to sorghum, or even wheats and oats and quinoa, is, I'm sorry to say, I don't want to pick on any one crop, but it's absolutely abysmal. In some places where I travel, where rice is such a staple in the diet, there's actually an epidemic of diabetes, because it's basically, it's the white bread or the iceberg lettuce of the grains world. It's filling, but it's not providing your body really what it needs. So let's move on a little bit. Let's actually dive into some of the research around human health. We have an institution here in Nebraska called the Food for Health Center. And the Food for Health Center is one of 6 institutions on the entire planet that exclusively studies the human gut microbiome. And what is the human gut microbiome? Well, that is the microbiology within all of our stomachs that has evolved alongside us. And when that microbiology is healthy, we're healthy. Bottom line. When it is not doing well, we do not feel well. And what the Food for Health Center was able to do after 6 years of study, they published 2 papers in 2022, both in the journal Nature, which is a highly esteemed publication in science, that showed that sorghum has a positive role in rebalancing the human gut microbiome. Now, why would that be? Well, remember that microbiology evolved alongside humans. Sorghum and millets were some of the first grains that humans cultivated. So we evolved alongside those grains. And so as we evolved alongside those grains that were cultivated back in Mesopotamia and other places, parts of Africa, Asia in particular, our gut microbiology evolved along with it, and it still prefers those grains. So you can check these out. Again, these 2 studies are also available online. Again, they're in the journal Nature. I highly recommend that you check those out. Here's some more findings. So the United Sorghum Checkoff Program, to talk about them again, here a couple of years ago, they hired Dr. James Painter and Maggie McGinnis to basically do a meta-analysis, to take over 200 research papers that have been published internationally, independently at different research institutions in regard to human health, and to compile that data. What are the common themes? What are the findings that they found out of these more than 200 research papers that have been peer-reviewed and published? And what they found were health benefits really deriving from polyphenols and tannins in particular. Things like anti-carcinogenic benefits, anti-diabetic benefits, heart health benefits, anti-inflammatory benefits, and more, quite frankly. This is absolutely remarkable work. And in fact, some of it was even replicated on a small scale by Dr. Gallibrini's team at the Catholic University in Rome, where they took some pasta made from 100% sorghum compared with pasta made with traditional wheat flour. And they fed human populations, patients within the hospital, these two different types of pasta exclusively each. And what they found was, with the patients that had the sorghum-based pasta over a period of time, they did see a decrease in anti-inflammatory disease in particular, as well as anti-diabetic and heart health benefits. So this is not only peer-reviewed in the lab, but it's also been shown in a real-world human setting. So we know that sorghum is good for the environment. We know that it is good for humans. So how do we leverage this? Now, this is a conversation that I want to, first of all, applaud the nation of India, the delegation of India, for starting internationally. But it's a conversation now that our organization is having serious conversations about how to extend the conversation beyond the International Year of Millets. Now, I was in Rome at the United Nations FAO for the opening ceremony of the International Year. I had a chance to interact with the Indian delegation while I was there. From that meeting, by the way, I made a commitment to visit ICRISAT in Hyderabad, which I did on my recent travels to India. And we owe the Indian representation a tremendous thanks for bringing the International Year of Millets to fruition. Now, this has been great in India, but outside of India and outside of Africa, in particular in Europe, South America, North America, it hasn't gained much traction. So our organization's job, one of our jobs, is to continue to push that ball forward. And how do we continue the conversation when the international year ends? Now, some of the things that were discussed while I was in India was the idea that, at least within the country, leadership would discuss having something called the Decade of Millets. And that's a good start. But again, that's just India, right? We have to move this conversation beyond into areas where we're seeing monoculture cropping systems, in particular in Europe and North America and South America. How do we improve that conversation? And so this is something that we're continuing to build on. We're not going anywhere once the international year ends. In fact, we're continuing to grow and build our network so that we can be more effective in connectivity and in promotion. So let's talk a little bit about one of our missions, which is that consumer outreach and education. And I hope you get a chance to check these out. This is a series of children's books that we've published. It's actually one of our funding sources for Sorghum United. And it's not aimed actually at folks in agriculture. It's aimed at people outside of agriculture. In particular, these books, which are graphic novel or comic style books, are aimed at children between the ages of 9 and 13, but more importantly, they're aimed at their parents. And we wanted them not just to be educational, but we wanted them to be fun, engaging. So, there's a little bit of humor. There's a little bit of adventure. In fact, I describe this as, if you're familiar with the references, Indiana Jones meets Captain Planet, right? So if we want to meet our consumers and help them to understand what we're trying to do and the value of these grains, we've got to find ways to be accessible to them. And we can't do that just through raw education. It has to be entertainment as well. There is actually an educational poster series that is available for free download on our websites, both at sorghumunited.com and at sorghosquad.com. These were designed for the International Year of Millets. In fact, while I was in Rome at the opening ceremony, I hand-delivered copies of these 10 posters, and they were on display at the FAO office in Rome. I'm not sure if they still are, but they were for the opening ceremony. They're great additions to classrooms. We've had them translated into several languages. So check those out. They're free for download. The books are not free for download, but they build upon the posters. And those can be found on Amazon as well as on sorghosquad.com. You see the first 2 books there in the series are available now, both in digital format and I believe both in hard copy as well. The third book, chapter 3, will actually be published any day now. It's in process right now with the publisher, and there will be a 4th book available, we're hoping, for by November 1st. So that'll be the first story arc within the series, and if they do well globally, which we are launching globally as well, not just in North America, if they do well globally, then we will continue on with that series next year. Again, this is one of the funding sources for Sorghum United, so let's talk about that for a minute. We're a recognized 501c3. We're an NGO. So that means that we could go and put a hand out to our many industry partners internationally, and we could ask for donations to fund our work. However, we're preaching to people about economic self-sustainability through entrepreneurialism, both on the farm and through processing. And we feel that we need to put our money where our mouth is. So while we could accept donations, we feel like we need to build our funding sources in an entrepreneurial way so that we can understand the people that we're working with when they're trying to address entrepreneurial challenges on their own. And so in our phase one of Sorghum United, which we became a formalized NGO here at the beginning of 2023 with the International Year, we're developing our own funding sources that can also aid in our mission. Sorghum Squad books are one of those. We have another initiative that I'll be very excited that I think is going to be transformative in agriculture and in processing and value chains that we'll be able to announce and discuss further early next year, maybe as early as February next year. So look for that. So we're trying to be entrepreneurial. We're trying to build markets. We're trying to speak to people outside of agriculture. I highly encourage you. I understand that the books are not translated into Hindi, but I also understand that many of your schools in India do teach in English. And I would highly recommend that you share these books, this series with your educators, with your departments of education, as a way to continue to further education for Indian students in regard to demand for sorghum and millets, which is going to be really important when we're talking about generational transformative change in agriculture. This is a good illustration of why regional value chains matter. Okay, so we're going to shift gears. I live in Nebraska. That is the state highlighted on your map there. This is just used as an example. Nebraska, as you can tell, is the only state in the United States that is quadruply landlocked, which means you have to go through at least 5 states in any direction to get to an ocean or ocean ports. What this means for international trade when it comes to commodity markets is the Nebraska farmer is never going to get a premium for their grain. Even when sorghum is trading at an all-time premium, those folks down in Texas in the South that are right on the Gulf, or in Louisiana near New Orleans that are very close to the Gulf, they're always going to get the premium because they don't have the transportation costs. In the United States, a big problem that we have in agriculture is the cost of rail transit. And I think this is probably true where you live as well. And so that means that our farmers are getting a lower price at the grain elevator for their product, because the grain elevator then is going to have to pay a higher price for the transit on the rail to get it down to a port, to get it on a boat, to go overseas, usually in this case to China. Now, while that might be a disqualification for premiums in states like Nebraska or places like Uganda or Tanzania or maybe even in northern India, in regard to premiums for sorghum for producers' products, it's a attribute actually when we talk about local markets. So because we are geographically central in the United States, for example, that means we're 2.5 days by truck from anywhere within the continental U.S. We also grow these grains here, so locating value-added processing proximate to the production of grains, whether that's sorghum or any other grain, means that you can decrease supply lines for processors and increase profitability for farmers all at the same time. And in a place like Nebraska, where you also have excellent road, rail, and air infrastructure, this makes a lot of sense for processors to locate their processing proximate to the production of grain. What happens now is they might be buying grain from Nebraska for a company, say, in California. They're sending it to places like Ohio to the east to have it processed and cleaned and then bagged and sent back to California in the west to get on a grocery store shelf. This is an incredibly inefficient system. And we saw during COVID just how vulnerable systems like this can be in regard to food security. And again, places like Uganda, I love to talk about Uganda because we have partners in Uganda that they'll be happy to tell us that they're growing sorghum there. Actually, Tanzania is another great example. Growing sorghum in these places, but it's only considered animal feed, which is a low value market. There's not the value added human processing for these products. And at the same time, they're struggling with malnutrition and hunger. And it's because they just don't understand that these are grains that are good for humans, not just their livestock. And they don't have the access to value added processing locally to be able to feed their populations in a nutritive way. So this is a big reason why I get excited about what we're doing, because I think we can create some systemic change in regard to food security, environmental and economic sustainability as well. So let's reference another book. I'm a big reader, and this has been one of my favorite books for a very long time, well over a decade. The author is Jared Diamond. He's he may be retired at this point, a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Mr. Diamond actually started his work as a surveyor for oil and natural gas companies in the South Pacific, and became very passionate about conservation and environmental ecosystems doing that work. Now, he's written several books on a wide range of topics. In fact, he won a Pulitzer Prize for a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. But this is my favorite one and the most impactful to me. His book is called Collapse. And what Jared Diamond does in this book is he compares different societies throughout history, for example, and how they interacted with their environment to change their social norms or not, which allowed them to survive or not. So, for example, in Easter Island, where they built giant moai statues, those big stone statues that whenever you Google Easter Island, you see all over, only got bigger and bigger over time. And every time you built one, in order to transport it, you would have to cut down several trees to create, a log rolling moving system to get it to the right place. And over time, the competition and the importance of these moai were such that eventually they cut down that last tree, and they didn't ever recover from it. The Easter Islanders were gone shortly thereafter. They destroyed their ecosystem and could not adjust their cultural norms. In contrast to this, in Greenland, when the Vikings landed there, swine were a very important part of their culture. What they found was that the soil was too fragile in that area in Greenland to sustain swine. And so they had a choice: either survive by changing their cultural norms, or go the way of the Easter Islanders by retaining those the cultural norms of importance of swine in their diets. And so what they did was they switched to sheep, and sheep were a much better option. And as a result, the Vikings were able to thrive, and there are still people living in Greenland today that claim descendancy from that colony. So Jared then pulls out from these different examples, and those aren't the only examples he uses, and he looks at the Earth as an island, which in a great sense it is. To our knowledge, there is no definite proof of intelligent life or inhabitable planets that we can reach, within any significant foreseeable future. And so when we look at the Earth as an island, thinking about how we challenge and change our cultural norms, reshaping those agricultural paradigms, just like we talked about in the very first slide of this presentation, it's important that we consider whether or not we're going to go the way of the Easter Islanders or the Vikings. Are we going to be able to change a cultural dependence upon monoculture cropping systems, in particular in maize, rice, wheat, and add to that instead, supplement that with sorghum and millets within rotation? And if we can't address that in a way that provides for diversification, I'm afraid Jared tells us exactly what's going to happen to our society and our culture globally, just in this book. I highly recommend reading this one. So this presentation was originally developed for a meeting I went to around the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in Australia back in 2022. But I've left the policy recommendations in here because I think this is still important and a pertinent piece for any conversation that we're going to have. So what are the policy recommendations? Well, first of all, we need more investment in research and development for small cereal grains such as sorghum and millet. And we're seeing this in India. We're seeing it in Senegal for West Africa, but we're not seeing it in Europe. We're not seeing it in South America, and we're not seeing it in North America. I mentioned that $65 million grant from the USDA to quantify the climate smart attributes of sorghum. That's fantastic, but it's just a drop in the bucket compared to other grains. And we keep talking about additional research dollars, but we need to really start putting our money where our mouth is. Investment in producer resources. Now, there are some great producer resources, again, from our friends at the United Sorghum Checkoff Program. If you go to their website, you'll see field guides for growing sorghum in particular, not millets, but sorghum. These are great. We need more organizations putting out information like this. ICRISAT does a great job as well there in India. But we need to invest not just in the development of the resources, but the distribution of the resources. Because if you're a farmer that hasn't grown sorghum ever, or hasn't grown it in a long time, maybe a generation, you need to know how to do it. We need to be able to give those farmers tools to do it. We need to invest in consumer education and markets development. And let's face it, countries like the United States, we can decrease our health spending budgets for populations that are at risk and needing assistance with healthcare spending. We can decrease those costs by improving their nutritional intakes, right? But consumers can't demand a product they're not familiar with. So we need more investment in consumer education, not just what we're trying to do through Sorghum United with our books, but we need actual ad campaigns, dollars put into advertising campaigns that can improve human diets and decrease health risks. And by the way, in so doing, we're also going to be able to increase our economic output because we'll have more people that are healthier and able to work. This is very, very important. And I really feel that Sorghum and Millets provides, some keys in addressing some of the biggest issues that not only do we face on a planetary scale, but even culturally, country by country. This investment in quantification of environmental impacts of cereal grains, we've talked about that already, but there needs to be more to be done. It's easy to say things like climate smart, but what does that actually mean? And until we really quantify it, it becomes a politicized term that has several different meanings depending on who's saying it. Entrepreneurial incentives for product development and startup businesses. So, I mean, there are in a lot of places, including Nebraska, where I live, there are incentives for entrepreneurial development and small business incubation, and that's fantastic. But we need to jumpstart entrepreneurial development of products made with sorghum and millets. And maybe we do that through some additional funding specifically for those grains. And again, not just in the food space, but in the fuel and fiber space as well. So we're talking about ethanol production. We're talking about particle board creation using the biomass, bioplastics, industrial products like blow and insulation. These are things that are being done, by the way. Carbon fiber. There's a company here in Nebraska in particular that's working on scaling up a patent that they've been able to create carbon fiber using renewable grain sorghum versus petroleum products. These are companies that we need to be investing in as a culture if we're going to change the paradigm. And then producer incentives for multi-cropping systems. Now, when I go to Washington, D.C., and I'm there a few times a year talking policy, what I always like to tell these policymakers is just it's one thing for us to provide incentives for farmers to plant different grains like sorghum and millets, and conservation programs are fantastic, and we should have those. But really the incentive that the producer needs is value-added markets. If there's a value-added market and they can make a profit doing it and they can feed their family at the same time, then they're going to grow it. We don't have to pay them to grow something that the market is paying them to grow. And that's very, very important. And it's something that we need to be thinking about. This picture down here in the bottom of your screen, this is something I thought was really quite fascinating. This actually comes from a farm in France last year. And again, France, southern France in particular, just like much of the Mediterranean basin, faced a terrible drought last year. This is the same farmer from the same farm, two different images. On the left side of your screen, you see his wheat field, which is decimated. It's gone. The drought was so bad, the wheat is finished. It's not going to come back. On the right hand is his field of sorghum just across the road. Same drought conditions, same area, same region, same soil, but despite the drought, it's still able to produce. This is a very powerful picture. This was published, by the way, in a publication in Europe last year. I snagged the screenshot from the video in particular because I thought it was so awe-inspiring. So something to think about. So with that, ordinarily, if we were in person, I would take questions. But again, because we had technological problems and timing didn't work out for me to be there in person with you, I would encourage you, if you have questions, please send me an email at sorghumunited@gmail.com. I am also on WhatsApp. My number there is on the screen. You can join our global Sorghum United group. Right now, it is kind of a rudimentary chat group, also on WhatsApp. If you go to the website, sorghumunited.com, at the top of the page, you'll see a button that you can click that'll link to that group. You'll get the link so you can join. If you decide to join, it's free, by the way. You'll join a group of well over 100 stakeholders on every continent, except for Antarctica. that represent all points in the value chain, the exchange of ideas that's able to happen there, the promotion of individual businesses and products that happens there. This is very worthwhile. I highly encourage you, regardless of where you're at in your career, whether you're a student or an entrepreneur or a farmer yourself, I highly encourage you to become a part of that, introduce yourself, and just know that while it's a rudimentary tool at the moment, we are working on making a robust additions to that. So stay tuned for early 2024 for those announcements. Check out the Sorgo Squad books at sorghosquad.com, also available on Amazon. That chapter 3, I think, as the author of those books, not the illustrator, but the author, I think chapter 3 is actually the best of them, but they all go together. So check those out. We highly appreciate your support if you would care to purchase those. Again, available in digital and print. And share the word, spread it with your educators, spread it with pediatricians' offices, doctors' offices, hospitals, anywhere that there might be kids sitting in a waiting room that we can get in front of and get in front of their parents as well. So I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. Again, I apologize that I wasn't able to be there in person. I can't control the technology issues we had the other night with the router failing. And I certainly regret not being able to take your questions, in particular in person, but I look forward to meeting you next time I'm in India and interacting with you virtually. So again, thank you very much. And let's work together. It takes all hands to lift all the boats, right? So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your collaboration.